Hi, everybody. People are logging in. Good. Throw us a hello in the chat. There were some new names I saw that had registered, some people that I don't know, so I'm happy to see some newcomers. And then, of course, a lot of our friends who have been around forever have signed up for this one. Well, everybody, officially, you are welcomed to part 2 of the community table TIC-Talk, Untangling Trauma One Step at a Time. The main announcement I have today is that there will be evaluations at the end, one for HeartSet for Ryan and Khalil, and one for the coalition. We ask that you fill both of those out. And I'm not going to waste any more of Ryan and Khalil's time. I'm going to turn it over to them and let them do the thing that they do so well.
Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Laura. We're excited to be here. As Laura mentioned, this is part 2 of our series. But if you're new, I don't think you'll be too far behind. We have structured this series in a way that will allow folks to kind of jump in at several points. Although if you get a chance to look over our previous materials, I think all the better. This is part 2 of our series. Just really quickly for the newcomers, my name is Ryan Villigran. I use they and them pronouns, and I'm one of the 2 founding trainers of HeartSet Training Center. And our training center is focused on supporting especially supportive housing agencies as they look to employ more housing first oriented work, harm reduction based work, trauma informed care, of course, assertive engagement, and topics like that. So we're a pretty new training organization, but we're coming from a background in working in high fidelity housing first. So that's our kind of lens that we are presenting a lot of this through. And then for myself, I have a background, especially in mental health and substance use co-occurring disorders, and yeah, some other things here and there. I'll kick it over to Khalil to introduce himself.
Yeah, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Khalil Martin. My pronouns are he, him, and his. I live in the Philadelphia area and I am a therapist here. I really appreciate the education and training space, and I have my hands in a few pots there, but really value and appreciate the idea of trauma-informed care. So excited to be doing this series with you all.
Really quickly, just some shared expectations, things that you can expect from us and things that we'll expect from you as an audience. You can expect that we're going to engage you in dialogue today. So if you have something to contribute, we really want to hear it. And sometimes we'll be asking questions that are not rhetorical. And so we would ask that you stay tuned, stay connected with us. We are in this webinar format, so we're not able to see your faces, but just encouraging you to type things in the chat as you can. We'll make space for that to happen. And we'll try and highlight some of those comments, questions in the chat. Also, you can use the Q&A feature if that feels helpful. We recognize that there may be times where you won't agree with everything we say. And even in those cases, we really do want to hear you kind of think critically about this content and push back when you feel like you can and should. So bring it on. We love to engage that kind of dialogue as well. But in that vein, we are on a tight kind of 1.5 hour window. We really want to get a lot out to you in terms of content. So there may be times where we'll move us along, even if it feels like we're in kind of a groove of a dialogue back and forth. Sometimes we'll need to just keep it moving for the sake of getting all the content in. And lastly, if you complete our session evaluation, as Laura mentioned, there are 2. One for the Coalition for the Homeless and one for HeartSet Training Center. But if you complete ours, we'll be able to respond to that completion with a copy of our materials, slides, some training tip sheets, as well as a certificate of attendance within 2 weeks of the training today. So you can expect those things from us, and we are excited to jump in. So here's our objectives today. By the end of this session, we're hoping that you will be able to identify the 6 key principles of trauma-informed care. We alluded to these in our last session last week, but we're going to do a deep dive on those today. We expect, or we hope, that you'll be able to examine your current practices, both at the individual level and at your organizational level, for how well they align with the 6 key principles we're going to talk about today. And so that'll be a lot of our dialogue with you is, in what ways can you implement this one? In what ways do you see room for opportunity here, right? And so we're hoping that you can do some of that analysis together with us. Finally, we want you to be able to list at least 3 strategies for implementing trauma-informed care. We're hoping during this middle session of our 3-session series on trauma-informed care that we can cover some of the concrete practices. Trauma-informed care is not a treatment protocol, but we've tried to make it concrete where we can, things that you can kind of nip at and put into practice easily. So that's our 3 objectives we hope you'll walk away with by the end of our 1.5-hour session. In terms of an agenda, here's how we'll get through it. We are going to start with just a very, very tiny brief review of our last session, just some key concepts. Want to kind of recall those to your minds. And if you weren't here last time, you'll sort of at least know where we're coming from. We're going to spend the bulk of the session today exploring those 6 key principles of trauma-informed care. And within that context, we're going to outline those concrete strategies for things that meet those principles along the way. We'll kind of wrap up with preparing ourselves with some tools, understanding that we, the providers, the direct care practitioners, or we, the organizations, have some work to do internally or with ourselves, emotionally, psychologically, mentally, physically. And so we'll kind of turn our attention to ourselves. And then we'll look ahead to our next session, which will be in 2 weeks. Hopefully we'll have some time for Q&A, although don't quote me on that because we might be going all the way to the end. All right, here we go. Here's our short review. And let me drop a link for you in the chat, especially if you weren't here last session. This is a training tip sheet that we gave out last session, and it goes over these concepts. First, we talked about the 3 E's, and what the 3 E's are a way of organizing a definition of what trauma actually is. Right? So this comes from this larger quote. Individual trauma results from an event or a series of events or a set of circumstances that is experienced by the individual as physically or emotionally harmful, and that has lasting adverse effects on an individual's functioning and mental, physical, social, emotional, or spiritual well-being. So that is a definition that we really do appreciate, and you can see more content about that if you weren't here last time on that tip sheet. And then the 5 R's are assumptions that we should be able to make about our program and our practice if we profess to do, or if we say that we're going to do trauma-informed care, right? It's to realize the impact of trauma, to recognize its signs and symptoms, to respond to that trauma, given what we know about it, about how the brain works and about how people respond or experience trauma responses. We'll target our efforts towards resisting re-traumatization wherever possible, understanding that some trauma that people experience is at the hands of our system itself that is meant to help them, right? So looking to avoid that. And then finally, understanding that we will make mistakes along the way. We'll endeavor to repair that harm by leveling the power dynamic and meeting people kind of where they are and where we are as humans, right? Who need care. So that is our very short review that we covered in depth last time. And here I would like to set the stage for a lot of what we're going to talk about today in the 6 key principles with this concept of resilience. So I'll give you this definition. This comes from the American Academy of Pediatrics. And so when they made this statement in 2021, they really had in mind child resilience. And yet I think there's nothing about this quote that wouldn't also apply to an adult who also has experienced trauma. So their definition of resilience is to move through a traumatic event utilizing various protective factors for support and returning to baseline in terms of emotional and psychological response to the stressor. And so I love that because we talked so much about the science of the brain last time, and the way that the structures of our brain really enable or allow for these acute stress responses in the form of fight, flight, freeze, fawn, flop, right? And so that moving away from baseline is the uncomfortable feeling that people experience kind of into the future, those adverse effects that we talked about in our definition of trauma. And so, yeah, wanting to find ways to return to that baseline. And so there are many factors that enable a person to experience post-traumatic growth or experience resilience in the face of trauma. These are some of them that you see on the screen here. Having at least one stable, supportive, and caring relationship. At least one. Preferably many more than that, right? A solid support system is going to be crucial to moving through and arriving back at baseline from traumatic experience. The ability to self-regulate is another kind of key component of resilience. And we can do a lot of this work of enabling our folks or empowering folks with skills to self-regulate if they don't already have ones that are healthy and supportive in their lives. Many times we know that people self-regulate using risky behaviors, which is quite common. And so if there are healthier ones that we can add to people's toolkits, we want to do that. Problem-solving skills is another key component of resilience. And then finally, having positive experiences. So I wanted to talk about this concept of resilience because as we move through this next section on the 6 key principles, and in an effort to avoid re-traumatization in our services, so much of our work is going to be around supporting these factors of resilience, right? How do we arrive at these factors of resilience? And I think the 6 key principles target that pretty clearly. So that's where we are now, and we're going to jump into the 6 key principles now. Take it away, Kyle.
Awesome. Yeah. So the first key principle, I think we can dive right in, is safety. And now, what I think is really important to keep in mind here is that, well, Ryan did a great job of reviewing the 3 E's, right? But safety is actually going to be subjective, right? Safety to me is not going to feel like safety to Ryan or Laura or other people. Um, but it is important that clients and staff are feeling physically and psychologically safe. We like to stick that staff in there too, because trauma-informed care applies to, yes, you and the relationship you have with the folks that you work with, but also your peers and colleagues and the people you work around, or that you lead and supervise, right? So psychological safety especially is going to look a lot different for everybody. And I think that's why it's important to just ask sometimes. If you have the ability to manipulate safety or make somebody feel more safe in a space, we want to be asking. And sometimes it sounds just like that. Is there something that would make you feel more safe right now? Which actually encourages clients to identify things in the room or that might be more accessible, right? And less structural, because some things are out of our control when it comes to safety, right? Do we have security in our buildings? Do we not? um, and that sort of thing. But our communication also should be promoting a sense of trust and care for folks, right? When we're communicating with folks, we want to be conveying the message that we want to support you and we care about you, and that is already hopefully increasing somebody's sense of psychological safety. Um, we also want to be doing kind of appropriate preparation for the clients that we're engaging with. I think there is a possibility of sometimes over preparation, right? If we're reading every client note that exists and not talking to anybody about specific participants, there I think can maybe be some assumptions made or things there. But I think in general, you should know, are you meeting with an adult or a child? Are you meeting with somebody who might have an intellectual disability, right? Are you meeting with somebody who uses substances? Because that might inform how you're engaging with somebody. And again, increase somebody's psychological safety. I think a really good example of preparation that might feel and represent safety to folks is the idea of the warm handoff that folks might be familiar with. We don't always have an opportunity for this. Sometimes staff changes happen very abruptly, but if we do have the opportunity to introduce participants to new members of their care team in a way that is gradual and slower, I think this is another way that we might emphasize safety in our spaces. And we also want to listen to the stories that clients are telling us or participants are telling us without judgment. It's strange to say without judgment, but I think the idea of monitoring your judgments, right, is going to be pretty important. You will have them, right? But being able to check in with like your facials, if you are very expressive with your face, right, is probably going to be important here in the idea of psychological safety. I like to tell a story of one time I witnessed a clinical director roll their eyes at a participant that was on a team that I was serving, and that participant immediately kind of escalated from there, right? From something that really could have been avoided if, you know, the care worker interacting with them hadn't done this with their face, right? So safety can look a lot of ways. And again, this is like organizational safety, but also safety between me and the folks that I'm serving. We used to have a colleague named Jonas. He was a therapist, and he would talk about trauma-informed care, meaning his desk should look neat and tidy when clients walk into his space, right? Because that might represent something to somebody. If your desk looks out of control and is very cluttered, what's your ability to handle me and what I come with and to help me keep my life together, right? That's an example that I really appreciated him sharing as being an example of trauma-informed care. If you've ever been in a crisis training with Ryan and I, yeah, we're ready for the next slide, Ryan. You might have seen this slide or the idea of solid object relationship model might sound familiar to you. We like to talk about this in the crisis management and de-escalation sort of space, but it also has some context in the trauma-informed care space. And the most important pieces here is that sometimes clients come with a lot of stuff, right? They might represent that kind of that scribble on the left side of the slide that you see. And it's really important that when clients are coming and feeling a lot of overwhelm and anxiety and whatever they're carrying, right, that they have something solid to anchor to, right? So we want to try the best we can to be that solid object. And we do that by displaying confidence, right? We are verbally reassuring, we are non-threatening, and a client knows that they can look to us for care and support. So I think some sort of certainty in the work that you're providing and the care um, that you're giving it is going to be really important here. And clients being able to know, okay, I can go to Shannon for support with this thing when I'm feeling out of control, right? Participants are typically able to identify when they're not feeling in control, right? So having a safe person or a solid object to kind of anchor to um, is also going to be pretty helpful for the idea of psychological safety.
I just want to add one really quick thing for folks. As you may notice that we're delivering each of these key principles and then talking about strategies to actualize those principles. And so this solid objects relationship model is actualizing that safety principle. And I really do see this as a skill, not just as a mindset, right? How do I manage my reactions, manage myself so that I appear and am confident, consistent, settled? I'm a solid object. And I do think that is a skill because when we're talking with folks, like we're having emotional reactions all the time, right? And yet I have to be able to manage myself and my reactions so that I can be that solid object. So I see this as a skill, a concrete skill that we can work at and get better at as we practice longer and more and with intention.
Yeah, thanks for adding that, Ryan. And it's important to know that we're not always certain about the work that we're doing or the next steps or what's going to happen in a participant's life, right? So there might not actually be confidence in that idea, but we should be confident in our idea to pivot and support maybe emotionally, right? And maybe that's how we're displaying confidence if we're not sure of like specific answers or next step for folks, right? We might be confident in the empathy we're able to share with somebody or lend to somebody. Support we're able to give in that moment. You don't have to know the answers to be the solid object. Alrighty. The next key principle is trustworthiness and transparency. And this is going to be exactly what it sounds like, right? We want our services to be transparent with no surprises. We don't want to move somebody into a unit and say, hey, we're going to come see you biweekly, and then we're at their unit every 2 or 3 days, right? We want to be able to let folks know what they're getting into, what they can expect from us, and make sure we're avoiding surprises, even if we feel like they are good surprises, right? We've seen this go wrong many times where we think we're surprising somebody with something good, or something tangible, and that is triggering something, right? And again, I think this goes back to the experiencing piece that is so important to the idea of what is a trauma, right? I'm going to experience this event differently than you are. So the surprise, even though you feel it's good, might not actually make me feel safe. So predictability as much as possible is going to be important when you're working with folks who are especially traumatized. Um, it's also important to know that decisions are made with transparency, right? Again, if we go back to the idea of being uncertain about next steps or discharge or relocating somebody, we want to be communicating all of the different possibilities and options that a person has or that a scenario could go. And then the goal is going to be building and maintaining trust. Again, and that's among clients and staff. And I know trustworthiness and transparency sounds pretty simple, and it's like, oh, duh, right? But I am curious if anybody has any thoughts about how we might make this actionable. How do we communicate trustworthiness and transparency to our participants and the folks that we serve or our staff, right? We know trauma-informed care exists in both of these kind of situations. So feel free to fire off in the chat if you have an example of when being trustworthy and transparent with a participant went really well, or when it went really bad, right? And maybe could have been avoidable. I do have a concrete example of this coming up next, but before that, I'd love to hear from folks here in this space when transparency might have benefited you in the work that you were doing to move a client forward. Give some folks time to respond in the chat. Not making empty promises. Thanks, Kat, for sharing that. I think that's really important. Sometimes we feel inclined to be like, if you do this thing, here's what's going to happen. And then we might not be able to follow up on that, right? I'd say I'd even take this a little bit further and say maybe we're not making promises at all, right? Just because of the unpredictability of our work and of human lives and of the services we're providing, right? Again, letting folks know that there are multiple ways that this could end or pivot, right? I think is important, but maybe not making promises at all, so that we're not in a position of breaking promises or not following through for a participant. I think for a lot of folks that we serve, the chances that they've had a ton of folks in their life not follow through for them is probably really true, right? So being able to avoid that and not be another person doing that to somebody, especially when we want them to trust us, is one way we might be resisting re-traumatization, right? One of the R's that we reviewed. Joy says to have the individual be part of the decision-making process and to be realistic about what services can be provided. Yeah, I think being realistic really speaks to the transparency piece, right? We can't move you into a 3-bedroom, 2-bath house, but we can give you a 1-bedroom apartment if you're interested, right? I think the transparency piece is going to be really important. In the housing first setting, I think sometimes this looks like timelines, being clear about timelines, right? You might be housed when there is a unit available if you've been evicted or the first housing situation didn't work out, right? I can't promise to move you the next 2 weeks, but there's a unit available next week. If everything checks out, if it passes inspection, whatever, we might be able to move you in. And then Joy, I also like what you say about including folks in the decision-making process. And we have quite a bit of that in the next hour together, just about the importance of collaboration and mutuality, right? That's another key principle that we actually talk about, but including folks as much as possible certainly does increase trust in our settings.
Oh, I did want to add that I think one way that we can demonstrate trust is by like being. We talked about this already, like monitoring our judgments and monitoring our reactions. I think one thing that's going to happen when people have experienced trauma is they are going to try and push boundaries, right? And just to see how you react. Is this person safe or not? Are they trustworthy or not? And how we respond in those moments goes a long way in terms of our trustworthiness. If we immediately kind of come down with authoritarian reactions, attempting to kind of control people's behavior, we may not be easily seen as a trustworthy person. And sometimes this will happen over a long period of time, right? Like trust is not something that happens quickly. And so being in it for the long haul, I think, is another way that we can sort of support this building of trust and transparency.
Thanks, Ryan. So we want some of the tools that you walk away with to not feel so clinical. Trauma-informed care interventions can be clinical interventions, right? But also can be some of the things and opportunities that you have every day with your participants. So this is an example of kind of setting expectations that is very transparent and could help to maybe increase trust, right? Because we know that predictable communication involves making sure that information is provided with clarity, right? It's clear. And it's consistent, right? When we live clear and consistent lives and know what to expect to people, we tend to trust them more, right? So again, we want to avoid surprises as much as possible to help reduce anxieties that folks might be holding or carrying and to build trust and reliability. So what this might look like in real life, and this is what I mean by this is a really easy example. You're always talking to people about when we meet next, what to expect. So when we're talking about clarity, we're talking about outlining what happens and when using simple and understandable language, right? So an example of this might look like today we'll start with a check-in, then discuss goals and wrap up with next steps, right? Maybe that looks like a treatment planning setting, right? It's not just we're meeting it and we're diving in, right? Somebody should have a good understanding of what this time spent is going to look like. Giving an advance notice as much as you can, right? Giving participants or your staff time to process and prepare for changes is going to be really important to trauma-informed care, right? Because we're emphasizing predictability here and minimizing the idea of surprises. So this could sound like next week, our meeting will start at 2 p.m. instead of 3 p.m. That's a very simple kind of strategy and one way we can move toward trauma-informed care. If you hold a supervisory role or a management role of some sort and you have that control and that knowledge and ability, this is one way we could move towards trauma-informed care at an organizational level, right? Instead of the day of, oh, by the way, this meeting's at 3 o'clock instead of 2. Again, to avoid surprises. And then consistency is going to be that one of the final pieces in the idea of setting expectations in a way that is trauma-informed. When we're consistent, we're reinforcing key points regularly to build a sense of stability for folks. Again, we want to be that solid object, as consistent and as grounded and confident as possible. So the example here says, just like we discussed last time, your safety is priority, and I will do my best to keep you updated. And I think this is a really good example of that idea of not making promises, right? I'm going to do my best to keep you updated. My best is my best, and you can interpret that in any way that you'd like, right? But I'm not promising that I'm going to reach out to this participant tomorrow or the staff member tomorrow. I'm letting them know that I'm going to keep them updated within my ability to do that.
All right. Continuing on with the theme of trust building, why don't you just talk about some key components of trust building? Maybe this is self-explanatory, and I think we've touched on some of this already, but just additional kind of things to think about as we're trying to actualize trustworthiness and transparency. Yeah, we have said a lot of this already, but forming trusting and respectful relationships with participants does take practice. And I think, and I want to call out that like our own unconscious biases and our own sort of identities that we move through in the world play a pretty big role in terms of how easy, how challenging it can feel to build trusting and respectful relationships, right? And maybe you've noticed that it's quite a bit easier to build a trusting relationship quite quickly with someone who is of a certain identity or certain lived experience, right? Whereas other folks, it can be more challenging. So just wanting to call out that examining those unconscious biases, examining why things may feel more comfortable with some folks and less comfortable with others, or why it takes longer with some folks, is a key component of being effective at building trust, right? We need to be able to build trust with whomever we're interacting with. Starting with the assumption that folks can find their own path. We're going to talk much more about strength-based practices or like empowerment practices later on, but as a component of trust building, people can feel when you believe that they can do the things that they want to do and say that and things that they say, right? And when it's clear that you believe in them because they say, hey, I want to do this thing. And you're like, great, I'm so excited to be able to support you in that. That feels like you believe in them as a person and you're not just sort of condescending and saying, oh yeah, you're gonna go for that goal. Yeah, Khalil says participants know you believe in them, and again, that is trust building. That provides quite a bit of support for that trust building process. We also are going to want to remove obstacles wherever possible, so that we can help folks meet their stated goals. Being realistic about um, changes or accommodations you can make, and being flexible whenever possible. So if a participant says, hey, I want to achieve this goal or I want to go after this goal, we start with the assumption that they can do it. And then as we get into that goal work, we're trying to remove obstacles. And that is trust building, right? You believed in me, plus you're actually helping me get to the place that I want to go to. That is incredibly like transparent and trust building with folks. Letting folks set the pace is really crucial, especially with trauma-based work. I think we can get into some not great habits of asking people to kind of dig deep into sharing traumatic experiences. And some people may be ready for that and others not, right? And so I think if we're not careful, we can continue to sort of bring it back to traumatic stories or recounting experiences as we're trying to help people move through them, uh, but maybe before they're ready, right? And so letting folks set the pace is one way to increase both trust and safety in the process, in the narration. Finally, being consistent, we talked about that already, and being honest. And again, the promising things, the over promising things, that comes from a good place, right? I really want this person to have what they need. I really want to be able to do this for this person. And there are many reasons why we can't keep those promises. Another participant is in crisis and I wasn't able to make our meeting. Or all of a sudden we lost a grant and we don't have that resource available to you anymore. So many reasons. Or I double booked my time accidentally, right? And I couldn't make our meeting. It doesn't really matter. It's sort of the reason we may have to engage in some repair here because we are gonna make mistakes. We are gonna like not meet some of our commitments. But whenever possible, just sort of setting realistic expectations and following through with that. Do what we say we're gonna do. And then finally, pay attention. Watching for changes in people's presentation as they're talking with you, as they're engaging with you, can tell you a lot about where they're at. Are they experiencing a stress response right now, a traumatic stress response? Do I need to back off? Can we dig in a little deeper? Are they needing to kind of set this conversation down for today and come back to it another time? So many things can affect kind of where people are at and whether they're willing to engage with us at this moment. And so paying really close attention is another way that we can build trust by being so tuned in and empathetic to their kind of current present moment and what might be happening for them in terms of trauma responses is one way that we show just the connectedness and the support that we need to show folks. Our next key principle, actually, no, yeah, we're good. Our next key principle is peer support. And again, this is like if you look up trauma-informed care on SAMHSA's website, these 6 key principles will show up. And peer support is a critical component of that. Let me put up some things on the slide here, right? So peer support and or mutual aid or mutual self-help as a key vehicle for establishing safety and hope for people, right? The hopefulness especially. As a peer, I've been here, I know what you've gone through, and here I am, I've made it through. Therefore, I think you can make it through too, right? That beacon of what's possible in a recovery-based sense is what peer support can often represent, right? So lived experience and sharing that lived experience is going to be a promoter of recovery and healing. And there's, of course, plenty of data that bears that out in terms of integrating peer support type services into program structures. Um, what what bringing in peer support can also do is allow us or support us in resisting the expert mentality, right? We never want to be the ones that are managing our participants' recovery processes, right? As if I can check off, oh, I worked with 3 people this year who recovered from trauma, and therefore it reflects well on me. That's not really what good trauma-informed services are framed around, right? It's wherever possible, non-hierarchical, right? And so we'll often see these rules be put in place for people. No, it has to be this way. It can't be that way. Well, why? People will challenge. I was like, well, that's just our policy. That's not a good enough reason for engaging in whatever practices that we're engaging in. We should be thinking through and responding to what we know about trauma, right? Those 4 R's. We recognize trauma responses and we're responding in ways that are not traumatizing and that are supportive of safety. And so that's our policy type responses, I think, are not really person-centered. They're really about us and our organization and what we need. Yeah, so peer support workers are going to help folks kind of engage in and stay engaged in recovery. It's been shown to help increase people's self-esteem and confidence, their sense of control, their sense of hope, of course, and inspiration, their sense of empathy and acceptance. And then they tend to engage in better social supports broadly, folks do, when peer support is part of that equation, I guess. I do want to kind of make a statement here that I think it's not new that peer support should be included in our like recovery-based and housing support services. But I do think there is a level of tokenization that can happen in our organizations where we say, hey, we have peer support, but then we don't allow those folks to kind of rise through the ranks or are paid at a lower rate or seem to basically do the same job as our other case managers, but at a lower rate, right? And so I think examining that at the organizational level we'll offer some parallel process for how do we improve care for people? Well, it's by supporting everybody, right? And by really truly buying into this idea of peer support. So having those folks on committee meetings and being decision makers at the organization level is part of that process. I want to as we're kind of touching on each of these 6 keys, we mentioned this already, but wanting to hear your experience in your service settings. So I just want to take a really brief moment and ask folks um, how well integrated into your programs is peer support? Are you yourself a person with lived experience who shares that to help support people in your programs? What is it like for you to integrate this key principle into your work? I'll just pause for folks to respond to that. And as you're thinking there and responding and typing, I do want to say that like I think we can think about lived experience in a very broad way. Whereas a person may have not experienced being unhoused, they may have experienced being a substance user for a long-term period of time, or the reverse may be true. Maybe I never used drugs, or I never had a mental health diagnosis, but I was homeless at one point. Um, there are so many ways that we can bring in lived experience to enable people to feel safe and hopeful and that sense of recovery and inspiration.
Yeah, I appreciate that frame, Ryan, because your role might not be CPS or CRS, right? It might not be labeled up here, but you might have some lived experiences that might be beneficial to your participants or just the work that you do. We'll talk a little bit about self-disclosure next, and I think I have some more on that, but I appreciate that idea a lot.
Yeah. I'm not seeing anything come in the chat. I am curious to know whether people are integrating peer support into their services. Um, and if you are there challenges? Are there successes there? But we're going to move on to the next slide here, and I'll kick it back to Khalil to talk a little bit to dig into this key principle, because self-disclosure is an important component of having lived experience and sharing it. And how do we do that skill?
Yes, absolutely. So, if you are a peer or a recovery specialist, your role might be to be self-disclosing, right? Um, if that is comfortable to you. But it's important to know that our own self-disclosure of personal information should be treated with discretion, right? So we want to be thinking really strategically about when we're disclosing. And the kind of magic question, or I think I like to call it like a compass question, is like, do I or don't I? Is to really think about why we're sharing. Am I sharing this for the benefit of the participant or for myself? Right? If we feel like we need a space to be venting off and sharing our story, that's probably a sign that we need some more support or opportunities to be doing that, right? Because again, this client's experience of their life is not ours, whether we have similar shared experiences or not, right? So that's going to be a really important question to be thinking about. And some others might be, is this to build rapport? Is it to gain respect? Is it to influence the client's opinion of you in some way? Those are all answers and reasons why we shouldn't be engaging in self-disclosure, right? We don't need to gain in this space if our role is to be supporting somebody. Because you might have a ton of tools to be able to support somebody because you've lived experiences without having to name them. So again, consider timing, context, and there might even be agency policies around self-disclosure. I know that I have some peers that work in forensic settings who are told very specifically that there is information that they cannot share with their clients. Their clients are typically folks who are incarcerated, right? There's things that they are told and written into their policy that they're not able to share with the folks that they serve. I have an example here of maybe appropriate self-disclosure. Sometimes self-disclosure isn't necessarily related to our like life histories and what's going on in our personal life. Sometimes self-disclosure is what's going on in the moment right now. So I really appreciate this example on the screen that says, I can see how difficult this is to talk about. I notice I'm feeling heaviness in my chest just being here with you in this moment. I think we could even add to this is like, what would feel good, or what are you feeling in your body, right? Because another kind of really positive outcome of self-disclosure is that idea of like modeling something that looks like self-regulation or awareness, right? This is what I'm aware of in my body. What are you aware of in yours, right? Again, that keeps the focus on the client and not about me dumping like how I'm feeling or putting the client in a position to kind of comfort me in that space. Um, but it is kind of maybe like a modeling behavior and a chance for growth in that relationship with participants. So I think another just quick example I can think of peer support in my own life that is not maybe the traditional example that we think about is I used to work at an agency. It was an outpatient therapy setting, and our supervisor for our group supervision, she would come in and give some announcements, and we'd meet and touch base with her, and then she'd leave. And all the clinicians and therapists would be able to talk about cases and what they're feeling and what the work's been like amongst each other. And I think that's example of peer support too. Folks kind of engaging around their own experiences. And I think in other settings we've been in on the participant side, it's looked like having participants facilitate group sessions and group conversations, or to tell their story, right, and gaining some feedback and insight from their peers. Just hosting a space, right, that doesn't necessarily have to be facilitated by um, clinician or an employee, but um, is facilitated by somebody in the program.
All right. Our next key principle, we're moving right through these, feeling good, is collaboration and mutuality. And I guess I feel like we're a broken record here as we move through these, but so many of these are really about safety to me, right? Like encouraging and ensuring that folks feel safe, and because thinking about what trauma is, that loss of safety and that loss of control over their lives, or over our lives, is at the core of what makes trauma difficult to kind of move through and manage, right? And so again, so many of these are about ensuring a sense of safety and a sense of control over our lives, building that resilience. So this principle is collaboration and mutuality, and it really highlights the importance of sharing power at various levels between the organization, the workforce, the staff, and the folks who are receiving services, their family and community. That leveling of the power dynamics um, is an opportunity to signal to people that we are in a collaborative and mutual relationship. Um, it is your life, it's your healing process, and we're here to collaborate with you on best ways forward, as opposed to this idea that a person comes to a place to get healed. We hold the keys to recovery. We hold all the skills. Um, we have everything you need, and we're going to parse it out to you as if it was a resource, as if it was some like grant dollars that we can, hey, here you go. Work through your trauma because you're here now, right? And so when we can be partners in this process, again, supporting safety, supporting a sense of control. So thinking about also leveling power amongst staff at all levels. This one I think is interesting to talk about. We gave a presentation in December that was, what was it about? I think it was about culturally responsive care. And we had an executive director ask us in more detail, what does it actually mean to level the power, given that this person is an executive director, they are literally at the pinnacle of the hierarchy. And so what does it mean to enact this? Um, and I think sort of the parallel between client care and like management staff is that the folks who are influenced by changes are asked about those changes, and their opinions are invited, right? You're a part of the change process. It's not just top down. We enact these policies, these practices. Let's talk about what we need to do. And so the best ways that I've seen this happen are committees of staff that are mixed in terms of roles, but that everybody has an equal voice in those meetings. Shared decision making is another practice that we're going to talk about this in a little bit further. But as participants are making decisions about their care, we should be kind of inviting conversation around the pros and cons of those decisions, and talking. Maybe we have a longer view of what the potential consequences of any given decision could be. And so we're presenting those sort of in a value neutral way, right? Once again, it's your life, and we want you to make the best decisions for you in this moment. And I may not have insight into what that is for you right now because you're the expert of your life, but let's talk about it together. Let's make these decisions in a shared way where we present all the information, and it again is transparent. Recognizing that everybody has a role to play in trauma-informed care. I think just kind of want to highlight front desk staff, management, staff, cleaning staff in the building. Carlo gave the example of like a clean desk says a lot to a potential participant, right? And similarly, like the space should be clean and well cared for as kind of taking care of the physical environment, which offers a sense of safety. So everybody has a role to play, including the participant, including family, including larger community in a trauma-informed care practice. Let me see if I just want to offer a couple of the quick examples of collaboration and mutuality. when clients have a primary role in planning their own services. I think this should happen pretty early when we bring in new clients, and especially in like a housing first context. The care process can look very different from person to person. It is a unique and individualized process. And so engaging the folks that we serve in kind of deciding what services are you going to take advantage of while you're here with us? What do you care about and how can I support you? Instead of giving advice, we want to give support, so we can make decisions that are aligned with a person's values and beliefs. And in that vein, we have to identify what their values are, right? So we may take some time to do some values identification and belief identification as a way to further align with a client. Yeah, I think that's what I want to say there. I'll kick it back to you, Carlo.
Awesome. Thanks, Ryan. I think that's a great segue into the idea of addressing power dynamics. And just like Ryan said, so many of these things that we talk about being actionable and the like skill piece or actual interventions can fall into like so many different places. So addressing power dynamics can also just contribute to our safety, make us feel safe or safer, right? Um, so power dynamics are the implicit or explicit imbalance of authority, control, and influence between providers and clients. Now, if you have power, that is not dirty, that is not bad, that is not you doing something wrong, right? That is you having a work role or position or positionality that gives you more power, whether you want it or not, whether you work for that power or not. That's who you are, and that's what you come with in a space. Um, and there are some very real reasons that they matter, right? So power imbalances can reinforce feelings of disempowerment and distrust, even if you're not communicating that in your actions or your words directly, right? This can trigger trauma related to systemic oppression or harm. And that's exactly what we're talking about when we say this might have nothing to do with you, right? But with somebody's history and what they experience on a broader level, their relationship to power or people who have more power than them. Um, and it can also create barriers to authentic, effective engagement. And again, I want to say that some of this is completely out of your control in who you are, but there are going to be many things that are in your control, right? Um, and some I've never even thought of as like contributing to any of power dynamics until after I've experienced them, right? So um, in my time at a housing first agency, I was on an ACT team, right? We did some housing first work, and all of the ACT teams, the designs of the room, the physical rooms and spaces were very similar. They were complete glass, right? Clients could or participants could see directly into the room, see who was available, who was there. And typically all the teams had a pretty open door policy. Participants could come in and out. And what I think that signals is like, hey, you can come here and speak to me, right? There was no space that was like really necessarily off limits or behind closed door or somebody wasn't accessible if they were like a direct provider typically, or served on an ACT team. I think that's a really example of just like free movement in a space that isn't limiting somebody to a queue or like a waiting area because they're not the provider or not the worker, right? I think that's a big way that I think about this. Um, but some other ways that this comes up is because some of our own interpersonal stuff as providers, right? And I want to say that we don't need to be right, and we don't need to win. And if those are the feelings that are coming up for you, I think that those are signs of things like countertransference or burnout. There might be a reason that urge to win or to prove a point to our participants might be coming up, and can be addressed when you have the appropriate supports, right? So some other like surface level examples of power dynamics are going to be race, gender, trauma history is probably an example of what this might look like as well. Um, and I see a message in the chat from Susanna. Oh, it's a long one, so I'll take my time and get through the addressing power dynamics first. But it just might look like taking off our expert hats, or our provider, clinician hats, and just being a person because we're serving and working with and for other people. I'm trying to think about what else I want to share here, but I think we might have some other places this idea can come up, the idea of addressing power dynamics. I mainly want folks to know that these aren't always in your control. You're not doing wrong because you have more power. Some of this just occurs naturally, right? But maybe can be addressed in some subtle and really simple and straightforward ways. Alrighty.
I do want to read out Susanna's comment out loud. We had asked for feedback on ways that people are incorporating peer support into their practices. And of course, it takes a long time to like type up a nice, thoughtful message like this. So kind of want to call it out here. So Susanna says, peer support is embedded in their practice. I have a great deal of lived experience with ACEs and trauma, and I'm someone in long-term recovery. When appropriate, when working with clients, I try to go about it very carefully and be mindful of using therapeutic use of self. But I've had positive experience / therapeutic outcomes with some clients in sharing my relatable experiences / backgrounds, substance use disorder, experiencing trauma, growing up in poverty, without making it about myself, and using discretion to not overshare. It can really help decrease stigma, build safe, trusting relationships with clients in recovery and those who have experienced trauma, encourage discussions. And yes, all of this makes a lot of sense. Thank you so much for writing that, Susanna, which I think that just like really dovetails nicely with some of the stuff that was on the screen and some of the like research literature about the therapeutic outcomes that are possible with sharing lived experience. So it sounds like it's been a really effective practice. Love it. I guess my like final comment, and I think I touched on this in my comments on that slide, are I think most of us understand and know the value of peer support services. And I think the struggle with implementing it in a trauma-informed, kind of bringing this in as part of trauma-informed care is organizations, whether they're paying correctly, whether they're allowing peer support specialists or folks with lived experience to kind of be who they need to be in the space and feel supported themselves, I think is the biggest challenge where we are currently in 2025. But I don't know if that matches your experience.
Yeah, I think this is a great example of addressing power dynamics in real time, right? I am the trainer in this space, right? And it's like, whoa, this is a long message. I'm going to read it later. And Ryan's like, wait a minute, let's slow down. We can read this now. We have time, right? And that is the idea. We can choose to go along and follow our power, right? Or sit back and let what comes up come up and really address what somebody is bringing into the space. And I think that happens a ton with our participants. We might be in a space to be addressing one thing and they might have another need or something else entirely is coming up. We might be frustrated by that, right? But that says more about probably the context of our work role and our work with that participant than it does about what this participant is actually bringing to the table. So another real life skill I love to talk about and to think about, and that is really accessible to us, is a skill called verbal blending. I was first introduced to verbal blending in, I think, like 2017, 2018, and just took it and ran, something I really tried to do in my language and my work with folks. Verbal blending is a non-directive and supportive communication style that fosters collaboration rather than coercion, right? We are in like that collaboration and mutuality, a key principle. So I think this is a really important skill to be talking about here. So verbal blending really focuses on shared decision-making and empowerment and avoids forceful directives like because I said so, or that's our policy, right? I want to gently challenge folks to say, if you've said these things because I said so, or that's our policy, that is okay. I think we've all like been in those situations or have had those feelings, but is also kind of giving up, right? And not doing the work in a space. So one of the skills we might come back to is the idea of verbal blending. Now, I gave a definition and said this is collaboration and it's shared decision making, but I want to share with you what this looks like. So I'm going to give a little bit of a case example, and this is a real life example that I've experienced when I used to work at a residential runaway and homeless youth shelter. So the young folks lived there. They were assigned chores and had like a merit system, which I didn't necessarily agree with, but was the program at the time. And they were earning allowance, like cash allowance. And on the weekends, we do fun stuff. They could go out and spend their money and that sort of thing. So in this case example, a young person's chore was to load the dishwasher after dinner, right? To take care of the dishes. So a young person in a residential homeless youth shelter refuses to load the dishwasher. So what she actually said to me was, you know what, Colin, I'm not loading this dishwasher and you can't make me, right? Sometimes a traditional response that represents or aligns more with power and coercion and really emphasizes those power dynamics might sound like, if you don't finish on the dishwasher, I'm taking your allowance away, right? Or you're not getting your allowance, right? That's me kind of dangling this incentive to force this young person to doing the thing that I want her to do, right? And that's the important piece there is I want her to do this really for no reason. I want her to do this, right? Maybe I think I win if she loads a dishwasher, or that I'm right for some reason if she loads a dishwasher. But what verbal blending would look like in this situation would be to say something that sounds more like, you're right, I can't make you load the dishwasher, but I do want to support you in earning your allowance this weekend and going skating. What can I do to support you? Right? This sounds worlds different, right? It's probably more helpful for the relationship between the provider and that young person, right? If it's not just like, I'm taking your allowance away if you don't do this thing. Um, and what's important to know is this young person still might respond with something that sounds like, you know what, take my allowance, right? They may not respond the way you want them to, and that is okay. I think responding in this way and using like this verbal blending kind of format provides choice and really honors their autonomy, right? They made a decision to not receive their allowance ultimately is what that decision is, right? And our job is not to protect them from natural consequences. That's a stretch calling that a natural consequence, but whatever. And so what you'll see is this kind of response is short and sweet, but really emphasizes a few things, right? So the first thing it does is acknowledge the autonomy by affirming the participants' control over their own choices, right? So you're right. I can't make you load the dishwasher, right? We are acknowledging that that participant has control over the decision that they do want to make. But then there's an attempt to connect with the participant over shared goals and values. We know this young person really loves to skate and loves to go out and be social and spend their money on the weekends, right? We want to support them in that goal that is self-identified. That's a goal that they have for themselves. And then we're offering our support, right? Instead of making a demand, right? Is there a way I can support you in doing this? Again, this is a young person. Thinking about the context that somebody lives in is important too. Maybe they've never loaded a dishwasher in their life. Not only is this a young person, this is a young person experiencing homelessness, right? What has their interaction with the idea of doing a chore looked like in their life before, right? So there's a lot of things to be considering here. So again, what we're doing when we're verbal blending is acknowledging autonomy, making an attempt at connection, and then offering support instead of saying, you need to do this or else, right? We don't want to threaten folks. That does a lot to damage the relationship and could, again, risk the idea of re-traumatization. So that's the quick and dirty of verbal blending, a skill that I really appreciate, and I hope folks in this space appreciate that as well.
Thanks, Kalo. Another kind of tool in our tool belt for this principle of collaboration and mutuality is finding common ground. I know this maybe feels a little bit common sense, but let's think about it through this lens. There are many goals that we have for our participants in terms of possibilities for recovery, right? I want folks to be housed. I want folks to have what they consider to be a healthy relationship to their substance use. If they're a drug user, a healthy relationship to their kind of mental health journey. If they're dealing with that, I want them to have enough food on the table and like their bills to be paid. And I want them to have leisure and connection. There's so many things that I want for our participants, right? There are another set of things that our participants want for themselves, and that may not be a one-to-one overlap with all the things that we want for them, but there will be some level of overlap, right? In terms of the things that I want for them and the things that they want for themselves. And so first, we do have to meet them where they are, right? Understanding them in the context of their journey, potentially what traumatic experiences they've had, will shape that journey and like how they respond and how they're engaging with us. And so kind of meeting where they're at, we have to agree on the work, right? here's a possible goal. Here's a possible goal. Here's what you said you wanted to do. We have to be in agreement about that and do this directly. Like there's almost a negotiation of what the work is, right? Because there's so many things that I want. And then finally, we have to be aware of our own agenda. We can't be kind of trying to shove goals down people's throats that they're either not ready for or not appropriate for where they're at. Okay, I'm gonna pass it. Oh, this is me. Can you give me 1 second? I'll be sorry about that. I thought I was gonna have cat peeing in my closet. I didn't want it. Okay, our next key principle is empowerment, voice, and choice. When people have experienced traumatic events, when people have had traumatic experience, it can sometimes lead to the diminishment of their sense of voice and choice in life. The loss of safety can often feel like a loss of choice, that loss of control. And people are not always able to speak up with a sense of confidence and direct their lives in the ways that they are accustomed to or would like to, right? So this principle of empowerment, voice, and choice is really targeted towards promoting people's strengths and their resilience, understanding them as unique individuals with unique strengths, right? And so trying to build on those strengths rather than trying to get people to change to be a certain way, acknowledge what strengths they already have. And this is, I think, can be a really creative process. And if we're feeling burnout, it can feel like too much to do, right? It can feel like too much to sort of be so uniquely person-centered that I'm identifying specific strengths that this person has versus this person. I think we can see clues that we're doing this, that we're not doing this when we try to do the same approach with everybody, right? I've got my spiel that I say when I'm doing outreach or when I'm moving somebody into a new apartment or when they face challenges. I approach it in this way. And that's not very person centered. And it's not going to be in recognition of the specific strengths that are going to actually help this person move through their journey, right? So, empowerment, voice, and choice is going to be about fostering a belief in people's abilities to heal. I believe you can do this, right? I've seen it happen before. I'm here to support you along the way. I know that you have what you need inside you to kind of make it through. Let's do it together. Um, and we kind of mentioned this concept already, but staff being facilitators of recovery rather than controllers of recovery is, we've so many of these. Maybe we didn't say this yet. So many of these are like overlapping these key principles, right? Because here I see that element of what Kala was talking about in terms of power dynamics. For people to have choice, we have to kind of let go of the reins a little bit, let go of the reins of control. So wanting to help facilitate recovery by providing the tools that people need, the resources that they need, the support they need, being there for them. So some examples of this, of enabling empowerment, voice, and choice are when folks are provided with very clear and appropriate messages about their rights, their responsibilities, and their service options. You can go all these different ways. You have a right to grieve this. You have a right to go speak to the manager over here about this. You have a right to receive this level of care and this. We want all the options to be out there on the table so that people can feel like they have choices and are willing to take them. And when they start to make those choices, the sense of empowerment that can develop is really healing for folks. Yeah, I think that's what I want to say there. So, kind of touching on this key principle a little bit more, using shared decision making. Mentioned this just a little bit ago, but what shared decision making is really trying to actively engage folks in choices about their own lives. It's pretty simple in that way. But what we need to do is we really need to be asking folks about their ideas. And I think Carlo had a good example of this in the verbal blending, where he said, I really want you to get your allowance. How can I support you? And that is really eliciting their ideas, that youth's idea about the best support that they need. right? And they could have said anything. And then we can negotiate about what that's going to be. It could have been, well, I only want to do dishes once a week. Or can I wait 2 hours while I like chill on my phone for a little bit and then come back and do the dishes? There's many possibilities that can come out of that, but we're never going to get there unless we're kind of actively asking people about their ideas and what they need. We're attempting in shared decision making to kind of offer the best evidence about options and support in choosing how to proceed. In other words, if a person says, I'm really looking to get sober over the next year, we can offer kind of we've been in this work for a little while. What are the best options out there? I know there's a 12-step meeting down the street, but people often complain about that meeting. What if we looked at meetings that are closer to your house, right? Um, Offering our own expertise for what we think is going to work, but then backing off and saying, but it's up to you, right? I don't think that's going to work because of this, but I'm willing to support you in it if that's your choice. And here's this other option that I've seen work a bunch of times. I don't know, trying to be careful not to lean on the things that we want them to do too much, but offering the best ideas that we can. And so, in that sense, we get to blend our experience with the participants' experience. Um, in order to do this shared decision making, we are going to have to be pretty clued into the values that our participant holds. And one kind of interesting strategy that I just read about this that you can offer might be to do like a sorting activity of values, right? So offer like a list of values and have people kind of rate them, rank them in priority order for themselves. When I can understand and know what's really important to a person, I'm going to be able to offer so much more um, clear options to them about how to proceed, right? Oh, it's super, super important to you that family is a part of everything you do. Great. Every intervention that we engage in is probably going to include a conversation about how your family can support you from here on out, right? So, kind of doing a priority list of values and offering like examples of those values so that people can self-identify is one way that we can um, have some of this shared decision-making conversation. Okay. Empowerment, voice, and choice, right? Like that's one of our 6 key principles. And so I want to just talk a little bit more about doing strength-based work and how do we do that. Um, I have definitely found this to be an incredibly effective posture, but has at times been somewhat controversial depending on who I'm talking with. And it's this assumption that there is nothing wrong with this person. They just need a little support right now, right? And I have some of that support that I can give. And I think that's hard. I think why that is controversial is there must be something wrong with them if they need to be in a program like this, or they need housing support, or they need mental health or substance use support. And I guess it makes me think of this concept of like, what is disability versus what is impairment? Whereas impairment is, um, if I'm a drug user, I can't think clearly and I have a hard time expressing myself when I'm high, right? But disability is all the stuff that makes it sort of hard to live and meet our own needs that are socially imposed or environmentally imposed, right? And so, in that sense, I think um, carrying this assumption that there's nothing wrong with this person, but that there may need to be tweaks to their environment or approach that will enable them to live up to their own values is one way that we can have this conversation. And so we need to be digging in and helping people realize and utilize whatever strengths that they already have. Checking back on the last slide, Cullo just put a values checklist into the chat that could be used to help people identify their own values as we make those decisions. Yeah, so strength-based work, it assumes that people have what's needed within, and we're spending our time trying to find assets and opportunities to uplift what people are coming to the table with. We're also going to be actively supporting folks' autonomy and encouraging it. And then I wanted to draw this kind of particular strategy from motivational interviewing, one of the four main tasks of motivational interviewing is evoking, right? And it is tied closely to like drawing out people's strengths and drawing out their values. Um, and so one of the ways that we can do strength-based work is kind of a three-step process. Attending to folks, right? Recognizing what assets and opportunities that we're hearing in their conversation with us, listening really closely, inviting folks when we hear them identify a strength to offer more of those strengths and to like own that, right? When somebody says, when I was living on the street, I wouldn't let anybody come mess with my people, right? I was like the enforcer out there. That's a huge strength, right? Is fighting people gonna serve you best while you're like in your own apartment now? Maybe not, but I can see where it would be adaptive to dealing with that trauma, right? And so trying to invite more of the ways that, oh, you really care about the people around you, you're very loyal, um, you're justice oriented, you don't want to see people taken advantage of. There's so much in that story of being an enforcer at an encampment that speaks of strength. So inviting people to lean into those strengths and to continue identifying them. And then strengthening those statements that people are making by doing reflective listening that highlight those strengths. What I'm hearing is this, or when you tell me this, I hear this in you, right? So using kind of typical motivational interviewing skills to evoke, highlight, and reflect back to people the strengths that they have already. All right, I'm gonna kick it back over to Khalil.
Alrighty, so I'm pretty sure this is our final key principle. And it's a big one. We're going to simplify a little bit, but I want folks to know that when we're addressing cultural, historical, and gender issues, that it's very nuanced and huge and complex. But we want to be doing our best to acknowledge and address stereotypes and biases that we might be holding for the clients we serve. Ryan talked a little bit about what ideas do you have about folks and their journey and experience of homelessness. How did they get there? What do you assume about them here? We also want to offer access to and responsive services. Um, I mean, gender responsive services. Um, I think really tapping into what is in our wheelhouse as specific providers is going to be really important. There are going to be places where you need to tap somebody else in or tap out and get somebody else to kind of jump in with you or alongside you or for you. There are other instances where we might be reaching out to completely different agencies for best care for our folks. I think a lot about my time at Pathways to Housing PA, and um, we had a handful of folks who are extremely vulnerable to things like increased violence and murder because of some of the identities they hold. I think specifically about Black trans women. So one of the things when I was leading the polysubstance use team there that I did to help support those folks or better understand to support those folks, one, having conversations with them, but two, looping in another agency or two who is already doing really good work with trans folks to help us support those participants the best that we could. We also want to incorporate policies that are responsive to the racial, ethnic, and cultural needs of our clients and our participants, and also recognize and address historical trauma, right? There are a ton of reasons that our race, that revolve around race, that folks are hesitant to engage in medical care, right? This isn't our foremost thought when a participant needs an amputation and won't go to the hospital, right? But is a very kind of realistic reason to be fearful of these spaces, right? So one of the ways that we might address some cultural opportunities or historic harm is by embracing the cultural opportunities that we have for folks when they're coming up, because they do come up naturally, right? So cultural opportunities are going to represent the moments that directly attend to cultural identity. This is purposeful dialogue about a client's identity. And again, this occurs naturally. It's not going to be abrupt. Clients are not going to come to you and be like, can we talk about race? Can we talk about gender or sexuality? Right? But it makes sense if you feel like you're crawling out of your skin right now because I'm just saying these things. This means something, right, to your work and how you're able to show up for participants when they're bringing up these things. Um, typically these might be like historically taboo to be talking about in the workplace, but when they're impacting the lives of the folks that you work with, it is very necessary to be talking about them. But you do not have to be an expert, right? Um, the last bullet point on this slide says that folks who demonstrated a high cultural humility, right, letting people tell you who they are and going with that rather than making your own assumptions, led to fewer missed cultural opportunities because you're not making assumptions or stereotyping folks. And clients are more forgiving, right? If they know that you are generally open to them, to letting them know who you are, and what they bring to the table, when you do mess up, because that happens, clients will generally be more forgiving. A very, I think, realistic example of this, and maybe relevant example of this, is the idea of bringing race into the room. I think it's really important when you're doing work to um, sometimes, if you are sensing a barrier, to maybe acknowledge what's coming up, right? If I'm working with somebody who has some sexual trauma in their life at the hands of men that they've known, I might be checking in with them about how I present and what that brings up for them and talking to me about it and that vulnerability, right? We don't want to run away from uncomfortable conversations. We kind of want to, you can embrace that uncomfortability and that discomfort and really lean into them. Because we don't want to dismiss what a participant is coming to us with, right? Because what does that do? It leaves us open the opportunity of potentially re-traumatizing somebody when we're not valuing their experiences and what they bring to the table, right? Um, Acknowledging clients' lived experience is one way we can resist re-traumatization. Um, and I think what this might look like is this last bullet point here, something I think I've heard, or I've heard things adjacent to this. A client might say something like, I feel like the director doesn't like me because I'm Black, right? We might immediately feel the urge to dismiss that participant's concerns of racism, right? That is not our role. And I actually think might do some harm, right? When we are invalidating a participant's direct experience of harm. And might be how we are exerting or exercising some really harmful power dynamics, right? We're like, oh no, they're not racist. I know that, right? Or they love Black. These are not the responses that hold what somebody's experiencing when they're coming to you with statements like this. For the sake of time, I'm not going to ask for like feedback around this, but I think a good guiding question is how might we respond to a statement like this that doesn't dismiss a participant's experience of racism, right? Because that's what they're sharing. I experienced this thing. And a trauma-informed way to approach this is not going to be to throw it in the trash and act like it didn't happen.
Wanted to offer this other tool that we sometimes will talk about in our culturally responsive services training content, but it is a way to tap into what people are experiencing that might fall along race, gender, cultural lines, especially if we're working kind of cross-culturally or with folks who maybe we don't have a super clear understanding about kind of the exact sort of cultural um, presentation that they're with, right? So these Kleinman's 8 questions, I just really like this as a way of talking about the things that bring them to services in the first place, right? And I think we could interchange some words here. We don't have to call it an illness or a condition or something like that. But imagining, in this case, I think it was around medical conditions, but I can imagine a world where we talk about mental health conditions in this way too, right? What do you call your illness? You know, we have a name for it in psychiatry. It's called schizophrenia or whatever the case may be. But the important part about these questions is tapping into their own understanding, which often has cultural roots, right? So what do you call your illness? Well, we call it this in my community. What name does it have? Why and when did it start? What do you think the illness does? How does it work? How severe is it? Will it have short or long course? What kind of treatment do you think folks who have this condition should receive? What are the most important results you would hope to get from this? What problems has it caused? And what fear do you have about this illness? So again, trying to take off our hat of like expert and hear from the person about themselves. So addressing power dynamics in this way. And again, when we tap in these ways, we're probably going to hear cultural opportunities, right? Well, we call it this where I'm from. Oh, tell me about where you're from. Tell me about who calls it that. And we're going to learn, we're going to sort of have little breadcrumbs of things to follow that are cultural opportunities to dig in a little bit and know about this person. Okay, we are getting super close. We have 5 minutes left. So we're going to speed run these last 2 slides and get you on out of here. Preparing ourselves. We experience trauma, we experience secondary trauma, we experience vicarious trauma, and we are going to have kind of a much more in-depth training series on vicarious trauma in May. But we just think that this is super important. Dealing with ourselves, preparing ourselves is also engaging in trauma-informed care. So one of the kind of key principles here is this concept that maybe you've heard in other contexts, but we have to put our oxygen mask on first. We may not be of much help or support to folks if we are dealing with our own kind of present moment of acute stress responses, right? So trauma is going to affect our well-being, and we need to be able to kind of manage our own processes and increase our own level of resilience if we hope to be a support person in the lives of the participants we serve. So on the right, you see some signs of vicarious trauma and burnout that you may want to look out for in yourself, in your colleagues, in your coworkers, in the staff that you supervise. These are, and this is not a comprehensive list of things, but just wanted to offer that trauma-informed care is for us too. So yeah, looking forward to getting much more into that in May. Also wanted to offer some tools, and I'll have some links that we can provide you. But there are a number of screening tools that can be used in to kind of assess people's experience of trauma. And I want to be kind of cautious how we say this. Universal screening for trauma is best practice, right? Especially in a setting like supportive housing or with dealing with mental health and substance use care, because of the high rates of trauma that people experience. And so it is quite common practice to implement some kind of standardized tool that invites people to talk about their traumatic experiences to set the groundwork for what we might work on in our time together. But I also want to say that it could be re-traumatizing if our practice is to always use a short trauma tool every single time we meet with a participant. If it is going to continue to dig up traumatic experiences, that could be actually somewhat harmful. And so kind of being cautious about how we implement universal screening tools so that we're resisting re-traumatization. So I'll offer a list of those. And then finally, wanted to kind of talk briefly about some evidence-based practices that are out there. Most of these do require sort of licensure and extra training to conduct. I know Khalil is trained in prolonged exposure, and can probably talk about the way that it's effective for PTSD. EMDR is another kind of commonly used tool that focuses on kind of coping with the spontaneous associations of traumatic images and thoughts that come up, and then trying to kind of reduce the impact of those memories, experiences moving forward. We talked about seeking safety a little bit last time, but it is a manual-based, evidence-based protocol that's focused on co-occurring PTSD and substance use disorder. One thing that I noticed that I wanted to highlight here is that it may not be, if you're wanting to practice in a harm reduction oriented way, seeking safety is really much more about abstinence, but maybe there's value in it for you. And then finally, trauma-focused CBT is a way of addressing distorted beliefs and attributions related to abuse that people may have. So that is our presentation today. Wanted to offer you with some quick next steps for where do we go from here. I'm dropping a link to the chat in the chat for our evaluation. So we would love it if you would give us a little bit of critical feedback or helpful feedback in terms of the presentation that we gave today. And in that, you'll get an opportunity to leave an email address, and we can get you some materials and a certificate of attendance. And I guess I'll invite you to print some of our supplemental material that we're going to send your way, and just do your own assessment of, how are you doing as an individual and as an organization with aligning with these 6 key principles that we talked about today. All right. I'm going to stop flapping these gums. Thank you so much for having us out today. Thanks for engaging with us. And looking forward to seeing folks in 2 weeks for the third parter. In 2 weeks now, for the third part of this series where we wrap it all up.
Yeah.
Thank you
Thanks
so
so
much.
much.
Thanks, Ryan Khalil, and I hope to see everybody in 2 weeks. And feel free to invite anybody else and share the link when I send out the reminder. Take care.